In just 5 explosive minutes inside Capitol Room 2141, Jasmine Crockett exposed how Chief Justice John Roberts ignored years of undisclosed financial ties between a sitting Supreme Court justice and political megadonors. Millions of people watched as his confidence collapsed. She backed every word with court records, donor trails, and cases that smelled like corruption. He tried to deflect. She didn't blink. And then she asked the one question that silenced the most powerful judge in America. What did Jasmine say that made the country freeze? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill had seen hundreds of hearings, but that morning was different. The air inside room 2141 was unnaturally still, like the breath before a storm, charged with something unspoken, something waiting to detonate. The hearing had been called under the banner of judicial ethics, a term so often diluted it barely registered with the press anymore. Most lawmakers leaned back in their seats, eyes glazed, fingers tapping phones under the table. The cameras had been set up with the expectation of dull exchanges, polite evasions, and legal jargon thick enough to choke a conversation. But then the name was called, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped. A few heads turned, then more. The quiet shuffle of papers stopped. Reporters lifted their eyes from screens, and across from them all, seated like a monument of tradition in a Navy suit polished with power, Chief Justice John Roberts didn't flinch, because he didn't know what was coming. Roberts had weathered storms before, scandals, criticisms, confirmation chaos, but nothing in his decades of navigating D.C. prepared him for the force now unfolding across the mahogany table. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk in like someone new to the room. She moved like someone who had nothing left to fear, like someone who had already been underestimated too many times and came to collect the cost. Her dark suit didn't shimmer, her heels didn't echo, but her presence cut like a blade honed in courtroom fire, sharpened by every man who had ever called her too loud or too ambitious. For her, this hearing wasn't about headlines or career moves. It was about justice dragged behind closed doors, about silence bought with power, and about the people she carried in every file folder she held. Across from her sat a man who believed the institution would shield him, but Crockett had come to remind the country. No one sits above the truth, not even the highest court in the land. He didn't know it yet, but the silence Jasmine Crockett carried into the room wasn't passive, it was pressure, it was memory. It was every courtroom where she'd watched poor men stand alone, judged by a system they never had the power to question. It was every time she was told to wait her turn, to stay in her lane, or to be more respectful of institutions that had never shown respect to people who looked like her. And now that silence was about to collide with the man who believed he could still speak above it. Chief Justice John Roberts adjusted his cuffs, then leaned forward with the ease of a man who'd done this before, too many times. Let me begin by reaffirming the integrity of this institution, he said, his voice low, deliberate, and smoothed over with the kind of polish only decades of power can afford. The Supreme Court has always operated under a code of conduct, even in the absence of a formal mandate. We understand the importance of public trust. He paused just long enough to let the statement settle, then continued. It is essential that we maintain the separation of powers. The judiciary must remain independent, not subjected to political influence or reactive policymaking. That is the foundation of our democracy. Words like integrity, objectivity, and historic precedent rolled off his tongue like marble statues being slid into place. But underneath the polish was something colder, an avoidance so precise it bordered on arrogance. Every answer was a shield. Every sentence was a dance away from responsibility. He didn't lie, he didn't need to. He just built a maze of legal phrasing so intricate, most people listening would never find the exit. Reporters barely looked up from their screens, typing out sanitized pull quotes. Cameras clicked at regular intervals, more interested in optics than substance. A few older committee members nodded along, half listening, used to the rhythm of these hearings, where nothing truly got asked and nothing truly got answered. It was a ritual, robes untouchable, power undisrupted. Roberts knew this room. He thought he owned it. For years, he'd stood at the intersection of law and legacy, wrapped in the quiet confidence of a man protected by precedent. He believed this would be no different. Another performance, another checkmark. He had no idea that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for conversation. She had come for confrontation. And then it was her turn. He had no idea that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for conversation. She had come for confrontation. And as her microphone clicked on, it was no longer just a hearing, it was a reckoning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words came low and even, sharp and deliberate, like the calm before a controlled detonation. "Chief Justice," she began, her tone steady, eyes locked. "In your 2013 commencement address at Harvard, you said, and I quote, 'Your credibility is your currency. The moment people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses.'" A pause. The room stilled. Roberts didn't blink, but the echo of his own words hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. "So tell me," she continued, flipping a page in her folder, without looking down, "how does that credibility survive when just last year, a sitting justice failed to disclose financial connections to a party appearing before the court, and no one said a word?" The silence stretched. Then, just barely audible, the first camera shutter clicked. Someone shifted in their seat. This wasn't a freshman congresswoman reading from notes. This was a woman who had come prepared to cut through decades of ceremony with one surgical question at a time. Jasmine leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to underline the precision of her attack. "You've told this chamber before that the court holds itself to the highest ethical standards," she said, her voice still low, unhurried. "But where exactly do those standards exist if they're not written, not enforced, and not transparent?" She flipped to another document, this one bearing the seal of the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. "Your financial disclosure procedures leave it up to each justice to decide what matters." That's not oversight. That's honor code for the most powerful legal body in the country. She paused and looked up. "Where I'm from, an honor code doesn't mean much when lives are on the line." Behind her, aides and staffers sat frozen, not because she was loud, but because she was devastatingly exact. Her tone didn't accuse, it exposed. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but she raised one hand lightly, not to silence him, but to steer the moment back where it belonged. "I'm not done," she said, eyes unwavering, "because I want to make sure the people watching this understand what's at stake." She turned to the next page in her file and held it up slightly. "This is from the case Macon versus Delta Rail. Justice Harland, who, by the way, took 3 trips paid for by the very same parties involved in this matter, never recused himself, never even explained why. And yet the ruling came down 5-4 in their favor." She leaned back. "Now, Chief Justice, you can call that coincidence, but the people in my district call that corruption." The words dropped like a hammer, simple, unmistakable, unspinnable. For a moment, Roberts said nothing. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of the desk, a subtle tell of discomfort. His voice finally came, a notch less sure than before. "Congresswoman, while I respect your passion, I would caution against drawing conclusions from isolated incidents." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm not drawing conclusions," she said, voice cold as glass. "I'm drawing connections." The audience felt it, the shift. She wasn't just questioning Roberts. She was cracking the armor of untouchable power line by line. Then she pivoted, swift, seamless, deadly. "Let's talk about precedent," she said. "You like precedent, don't you, Chief Justice?" A rhetorical jab. "Dalton v. Mason County, 5th Circuit, 2009. A judge failed to recuse himself due to indirect financial ties. The ruling made it clear, even appearance of impropriety is grounds for removal. Not direct evidence, not scandal, just suspicion." She held up the opinion like it was an indictment. "So why doesn't that same standard apply to your colleagues on the Supreme Court?" No one answered, and she didn't expect them to. This wasn't a request for an explanation. This was a cross-examination. Her tone never rose, but the force behind her words grew heavier, like thunder rolling just beyond the walls. "I've seen young men in Texas, black, brown, poor, get torn apart by judges for failing to report income they didn't know they had. I've watched mothers lose custody over a missed court date. And yet here, she said, gesturing broadly around the room, we're expected to believe that 9 people with lifetime appointments don't need rules, don't need oversight, because they wear the robe? She let that image hang. 9 people, lifetime power, no one watching. She didn't grandstand. She didn't pause for applause. She kept going like a surgeon mid-procedure, too focused to flinch. You say your credibility is your currency, she said, returning to his words. But let me ask you, what's left when that currency has been spent behind closed doors? What do the people see when their appeals vanish and billionaires win every time? Her voice dropped a half step. They see a court that no longer rules by principle. It rules by privilege. Someone in the room gasped, barely audible, but it was there. A staffer looked nervously at a reporter. The cameras were rolling, sure, but what they captured was more than an exchange. It was a shift in power. For the first time in the hearing, Roberts didn't answer, and Jasmine didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it grow, let it breathe, because sometimes silence is louder than anything a Chief Justice can say, and Jasmine Crockett knew exactly how to weaponize it. The silence Jasmine let hang in the room was not empty. It was loaded. It was the kind that demanded response, and Roberts knew it. But what he didn't know was that the next words out of his mouth would not restore control. They would surrender it. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat, ever so slightly, but the movement spoke volumes. The stillness he had worn like a robe began to fray. He cleared his throat and leaned into the mic, the smooth polish of his earlier responses giving way to a faint edge. "Congresswoman," he said, choosing his words with more care now, "I must reiterate the importance of judicial independence. It is the cornerstone of our democracy. Without it, we risk undermining the very rule of law." A pause meant to be commanding, but now defensive. "While I understand your concerns, I fear we are beginning to politicize the judiciary, and that in itself poses a grave danger." The words echoed with the weight of legacy, but they no longer held the room. They floated in the air, brittle and hollow, like an old shield raised in a new kind of war. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't interrupt. She waited for him to finish, not out of politeness, but precision. Then she leaned in, just slightly, her voice steady as stone. "With all due respect, Chief Justice," she said, "independence without accountability is not strength. It's a golden cage, ornate, gleaming, but rotten from the inside out." The words hit like a controlled detonation, not shouted, not dramatized, just delivered with the full weight of lived experience and brutal clarity. Around the chamber, heads turned, not toward Roberts this time, but toward her. The quiet power in her voice had shifted the room's gravity. This wasn't just a line, it was a verdict. Roberts visibly stiffened, his jaw flexed, his hand slowly curling around the edge of the desk as if grounding himself. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but calculation, realizing that this wasn't a freshman congresswoman lobbing rhetorical grenades. This was a former public defender who had spent years watching courts crush the powerless under the illusion of neutrality. She had seen how justice dressed itself in robes while crushing people in uniforms. And now she was dragging that contradiction into the light, one sentence at a time. Roberts tried to speak again, but the rhythm was off. The courtroom veteran had lost the beat, and everyone watching could feel it. "I'm not here to politicize the judiciary," Jasmine continued, her tone sharpened just enough to slice without screaming. "I'm here because people back home, people without lobbyists, without law degrees, without legacy surnames, have watched your court tip further and further away from fairness. And when they ask why, they don't get answers. They get doctrines. They get silence." She paused, eyes steady. "So no, Chief Justice, this isn't about politics. This is about pain. The kind that builds when truth is replaced by tradition and power hides behind the word independence like it's armor." The line sliced through the room with surgical clarity. The Chief Justice's fingers tightened again on the desk. He looked composed but not calm. It was the look of a man who had walked onto a familiar battlefield only to find the terrain had changed. The court does not answer to public opinion, he said, his voice lower now but taut. We are not swayed by noise. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not in anger but recognition. It's not noise, she said, her tone unshaken. It's the sound of a country that's tired of justice being spoken in a language only the privileged understand. A murmur rose in the room. Not applause, not outrage, just truth, moving through people like voltage. At that moment, the power dynamic cracked. Roberts, for all his titles and tenure, found himself speaking to someone who didn't see him as an institution, but as a man capable of failure and no longer allowed to hide behind centuries of immunity. Jasmine wasn't yelling, she wasn't emoting, she was executing. One truth after another, each laid bare with a calm so deliberate it became its own form of force. You call this politicizing? She said. I call it surviving. I call it demanding that the law we're all told to believe in actually belongs to all of us. Every syllable struck like a gavel, not in the judge's hand, but in hers. For Roberts, the room had become unfamiliar terrain. His training, his tone, his tactics, they weren't working. He looked across at Jasmine, not like a superior defending his bench, but like a witness trying to locate the exit. And for the first time in his career, the courtroom, the one place he thought he could control with silence and structure, had turned on him. Not through rebellion, not through insult, but through clarity. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't finished, not even close. He looked across at Jasmine, not like a superior defending his bench, but like a witness trying to locate the exit. And for the first time, the courtroom, his courtroom, wasn't his anymore. That's when she made her move. Without raising her voice, Jasmine reached into the folder beside her, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a document bound by a single rust-red clip. No grand gesture, no theatrics. Just her hand, sliding across the lacquered surface of the desk, placing a packet of paper directly in front of the microphone like it was a loaded weapon with the safety off. I'd like to enter into the record, she said coolly, this financial report, obtained through publicly accessible filings and cross-referenced with campaign finance disclosures. The pages didn't look like much. No seals, no highlighter marks. But inside them was something more volatile than a scandal. It was a connection, a direct link between a sitting Supreme Court justice and a web of political investment funds that had quietly backed multiple parties appearing before the court in recent years. Jasmine tapped the corner of the packet. This hasn't been disclosed, not to this committee, not to the public, not even in amended statements. And just like that, the room cracked. A rustle rippled across the gallery. Staffers stiffened. Cameras zoomed in like predators spotting blood. Someone near the back coughed, sharp and involuntary, like air had gotten too thick to swallow. One senator leaned forward, trying to read the top line of the cover sheet. Another whispered to an aide, too low for the mic to catch. But the tension in the room wasn't just from the document. It was from what it represented. A breach. A break in the illusion that the nation's highest bench was above influence, untouched by the very forces that shaped everyone else's reality. What is this? A journalist muttered, half to herself, fingers already racing across a phone screen. From the second those papers hit the desk, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just asking questions anymore. She was holding evidence. Chief Justice Roberts didn't move at first. For a man trained in the art of composure, even stillness had become a tactic. But his knuckles whitened as his hand curled just slightly beneath the table. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence, once commanding, now rang hollow, like a bell struck too many times to mean anything. Jasmine continued, her voice cutting through the rising static of unease. Page 2 outlines a timeline of communication between a financial trust and a justice's family foundation. Page 4 includes transfer records coinciding with court filings. And page 6, she paused, not for drama, but for clarity. Page 6 shows a signature. That word, signature, hung in the air like a match over gasoline. One congressman whispered just loud enough to be caught on a hot mic. "This can't be real." Another leaned toward his colleague. "Is this verified?" No one answered. No one needed to. The expression on Jasmine's face said everything. She had checked every word, every decimal, every date. She hadn't brought a theory. She had brought receipts, and she wasn't done. These aren't accusations, she said firmly. These are connections. These are patterns. And if the court won't address them, then this chamber will. It wasn't just a political earthquake. It was a moral rupture. Because in a country where families had lost homes over missing paperwork, where lives had been upended over technicalities, the idea that a justice could sit on high and sign off on decisions tied to his own financial backers wasn't just offensive, it was betrayal. Jasmine didn't need to yell it. She made you feel it, like a quiet truth too long buried, finally clawing its way to the surface. She didn't point fingers. She opened files. And in doing so, she didn't just implicate one man. She indicted a culture. Roberts finally spoke, but his voice had shifted. No longer the even, controlled tone of a man above reproach. It cracked, just faintly at the edges. These documents, he said, fingers resting flat against the table, may represent partial information. Context is vital. There are internal reviews that... But his words faded before they finished, because everyone knew what they were watching. It wasn't just an answer. It was an unraveling. One strand at a time, the threadbare fabric of judicial infallibility was coming undone. Under the lights, under the pressure, under Jasmine Crockett's unrelenting gaze. And she wasn't finished. Not even close. Roberts's voice cracked at the edges, clinging to procedure like it could shield him from the storm he no longer controlled. But Jasmine wasn't here for abstractions. She wasn't here for technicalities or half-truths wrapped in protocol. She was here to bring the human cost into the room, and now she did. She adjusted the microphone, her tone shifting, not softer, but heavier, like each word carried weight not just in policy, but in pain. "Let me tell you about someone I know," she said quietly, but the room fell still. "Her name is Carla Jennings. She lives in Houston. She's a single mother, works nights at a hospital, sterilizing surgical tools after 12-hour shifts on her feet. Never missed a tax filing, never broke a law, but one clerical error, one misfiled form, meant the IRS flagged her as delinquent. And because of that, when her son applied for federal student aid, it was denied." She paused. No one moved. She appealed. She filed. She waited. She called. She begged. And she was told, on the record, there was nothing to be done. Case closed. The words cut through the air, slow and precise, like piano keys struck in a dark room. "Her appeal never made it past the regional circuit," Jasmine continued, eyes fixed on the bench across from her. "No hearing, no review, no mercy, just a number in a database deemed invalid. A mother punished because a government form misread her worth." She let that sit, let it burn. And while she was waiting for a second chance, a billionaire with a private jet and personal access to a justice had his case expedited by the Supreme Court in less than 4 months. Murmurs stirred, soft but growing. Jasmine leaned forward. Same system, different rules. There was no outrage in her tone, just clarity sharpened to a blade. "We are told that justice is blind, that courts are neutral, that access to the law is equal." She looked slowly around the room. "But Carla's son lost his dream over a typo, and a billionaire kept his empire. Because someone in that chair," she said, gesturing toward the table, "opened a door the rest of us don't even get to knock on." A hush fell across the gallery. This wasn't just argument anymore. This was indictment, and everyone felt it. Cameras whirred, but no one blinked. Even the seasoned journalists didn't dare look away, because they knew moments like this didn't come with press releases. They came with truth. Raw, undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett, who had once stood in Texas courtrooms watching justice break people in silence, was now giving voice to every story too small to matter in rooms like this. "We cannot pretend that ethics live in theory," she said. "They live in consequences, and the people paying the highest price are the ones who don't have lawyers or donors or friends on the bench." The atmosphere in the room shifted. This wasn't just oversight. This was exposure. And as Jasmine spoke, the perception of her changed, not just to those in the chamber, but to millions who would later watch the moment unfold online. She wasn't just a congresswoman now. She was a witness for the voiceless, a challenger of the untouchable, a mirror to a court that could no longer claim innocence through distance. And across the table, Chief Justice Roberts sat still, because there was no rule, no statute, no robe thick enough to hide behind anymore. She wasn't just speaking for Carla Jennings anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt the weight of a system that preached fairness but practiced favoritism. And now, with the entire room caught in that slow, suffocating realization, Jasmine aimed straight for the heart. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted his posture, but it didn't help. The composure he had once worn like armor was cracking. His voice, which had carried decades of courtroom dominance, now trembled on the edge of hesitation. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand betrayed him, shaking just slightly as he brought it to his lips. And then Jasmine asked the question, director, unforgiving, sharp enough to strip any illusion of neutrality bare. "Do you still believe justice is equal?" she said, her voice slow and even. "Or has it become a product, available only to those with access?" The room froze. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It wasn't meant for headlines. It was the kind of question that pierced not only institutions, but the people who had built their names on protecting them. Roberts looked up, but for the first time, there was no certainty in his eyes. He blinked once, twice. His mouth opened, and then closed again. When he finally spoke, it was a stammer. I believe the, the structure of the court must," but the words collapsed before they formed. His voice caught, stumbled, and died under the weight of her question. For the first time in decades of hearings, speeches, and public appearances, John Roberts was speechless. It wasn't the kind of silence that invited sympathy. It was the kind that confirmed fear, the kind that made everyone in the room realize he had no answer, because deep down, maybe he didn't believe in the balance anymore. Maybe he knew the scales had tipped too far. That question, so simple on the surface, had shattered something sacred, the illusion that those who wore the robe were still unshaken in their principles. The man who once spoke of credibility as currency now found himself bankrupt in front of the nation. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She sat still, shoulders square, gaze unwavering, because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about reckoning. She had asked the question millions of Americans wanted to ask but never had the chance. And in his silence, Roberts had answered louder than words ever could. The weight of that unspoken truth fell like a curtain. One lawmaker near the back whispered, "He didn't answer." Another, stunned, leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "Because he can't." The camera zoomed in, capturing everything. The blink, the dry swallow, the tightening jaw. But no spin, no press release, no future memo would be able to erase what had just happened. The Chief Justice of the United States had been asked if justice was still blind, and he couldn't say yes. And Jasmine, she didn't move. She didn't need to, because in that moment, she wasn't just cross-examining a man. She was putting the entire system on trial. And the verdict, whether the court liked it or not, had just been rendered. He couldn't answer, and that silence did more damage than any admission ever could. The courtroom, once filled with the practiced cadence of formality and control, was now suspended in a moment so raw, so unplanned, that time itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. Still, no sound. No cough. No shuffle of paper. No chairman's voice to change the subject. The cameras stayed locked. The aides froze mid-note. And the man who once commanded this space with a flick of tone or a legal phrase now sat exposed, utterly alone. Not a single colleague came to his defense. Not a single senator offered him a lifeline. The air was electric, not with spectacle, but with consequence. Roberts lowered his gaze. Not in shame, perhaps, but in surrender. He had built his world on certainty, and Jasmine Crockett had just shattered the illusion that it still held. Then she spoke, not to finish him, but to lift something far more powerful than victory. Her voice, low and grounded, slid into the microphone like a whispered vow meant for the soul of the room. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," she said. "No edge, no triumph, just quiet gravity. I came here to tell the people of this country they have not been forgotten." The line didn't crack like thunder. It settled like ash after fire. Slow, haunting, final. Some in the room blinked. Others swallowed hard. Everyone felt it. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just challenge a justice. She had rewritten what it looked like to hold power accountable, without shouting, without slurs, without spectacle. Just with truth, with composure, with pain transmuted into precision. The words she spoke echoed not just in room 2141, but far beyond the marble columns of Capitol Hill. Within hours, the moment was clipped, uploaded, and ricocheted through every corner of the internet. They have not been forgotten. It appeared in captions and headlines, on protest signs and in morning news tickers. The phrase wasn't just powerful, it was proof. Proof that somewhere in the machine, someone had remembered the people crushed beneath it. Proof that courage could still exist, not in loud gestures, but in unshakable clarity. Jasmine's voice became a signal, and America, weary of silence, finally listened. The clip didn't just go viral, it detonated. By the time Jasmine Crockett left the hearing room and stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the world had already changed behind her. Across the marble halls of Capitol Hill, aides were staring down at their phones, eyes wide, jaws slack, watching a 47-second excerpt looping over and over. On it, her voice was unwavering, her gaze locked forward. "I didn't come here to humiliate you. I came here to tell the people of this country they have not been forgotten." No graphics, no music, just her words, and the silence that followed. Pure, devastating, unedited. On X, formerly Twitter, it exploded like dry brush under lightning. "They are not forgotten" surged to #1 worldwide in less than an hour. Hashtags multiplied like sparks from the blast. Crockett Truth, Golden Cage, Justice on Trial. Even users who had never tweeted about politics in their lives shared the moment. A nurse in Milwaukee, a warehouse worker in Tucson, a teacher in Mississippi who simply wrote, "That woman just spoke for me." They didn't need to know the full history of the Supreme Court. They didn't need to read ethics statutes. They felt it, the unspoken truth she had finally said aloud. In faculty lounges across Ivy League universities, professors stopped mid-discussion. At Yale Law, a tenured scholar who had clerked under two justices froze halfway through a lecture on constitutional originalism. He played the clip, hands trembling, not because of outrage, but because of recognition. "This," he whispered to the room of stunned students, "is what judicial legitimacy sounds like when it begins to crack." His colleague at NYU called it the beginning of the end of the myth. Over in Chicago, a first-year student who had once dreamed of wearing the robe herself watched the video 5 times before posting. "For the first time, I believe I could enter that courtroom and tell the truth without flinching." Former judges spoke on record. A retired federal appellate court justice appeared on PBS within hours. "She was deliberate, she was prepared, and she was right," he said. "If even half of what was in that folder holds up, then we're staring down an institutional crisis of integrity at the highest level of American law." The legal establishment wasn't just reeling, they were re-examining everything. Suddenly, lifetime appointments no longer looked like safeguards. They looked like cages built to protect privilege from accountability. But it wasn't just legal minds. It wasn't just the political class. It was the public, the people who tuned out long ago, convinced Washington was a circus where truth couldn't breathe. Jasmine's clip cut through that fog like a blade, because it wasn't a speech. It was a moment of unflinching honesty, and people weren't used to honesty surviving the halls of power. News outlets scrambled to catch up. CNN ran a special segment within the day. What justice really means. The Crockett confrontation. MSNBC aired the clip 12 times in a single hour. Even Fox News, caught off guard by the public's reaction, couldn't avoid covering it. One anchor, usually quick to mock congressional hearings, quietly said, "Whether you agree with her or not, that wasn't politics. That was something else." By the following morning, An official petition, launched by the nonpartisan Judicial Transparency Coalition, had gathered over 2.1 million signatures. The ask was clear: reopen the dormant ethics investigation into the financial disclosures of Supreme Court justices. But more than that, the petition demanded the creation of a binding, external judicial code of conduct. No more self-policing, no more internal reviews. The people for once wanted accountability, and they weren't whispering. Pressure built like a rising tide. Senate offices received tens of thousands of phone calls. Congressional inboxes were flooded. Editorial boards from the New York Times to the Des Moines Register published urgent pieces titled, "Crockett was right, in time to clean the bench." Public faith in the court, already eroding after years of controversial rulings and shadow dockets, dropped another 8 points in a single polling cycle, its lowest in modern American history. And still the clip moved. In lunchrooms, break rooms, union halls, community centers. It wasn't the complexity of the law that caught fire. It was the simplicity of the question. Do you still believe justice is equal, or is it just a product for the powerful? That question began to define the debate in state houses across the country. In Georgia, local lawmakers quoted Crockett on the floor. In Oregon, an ethics oversight bill was suddenly revived. In Texas, her home state, a radio host known for mocking DC theatrics played the full hearing segment and quietly said into the mic, "She's not yelling, she's not performing, she's just telling the truth, and I can't stop listening." Within 36 hours, the House Judiciary Subcommittee released an unexpected statement. Due to the volume of credible public concern and the emergence of new documented connections, we will reopen our investigation into undisclosed financial relationships among members of the judiciary. It didn't name names, it didn't cite Jasmine directly, but no one needed the citation. Everyone already knew who had kicked the door open. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just disrupted a hearing, she had sparked a movement. One built not on outrage, but on precision. Not on division, but on clarity. And that clarity was contagious. In a time of noise, she had made silence impossible. In a time of spin, she had spoken straight. And now the highest court in the land was no longer looking down from its marble steps. It was being called to answer. And the country, it was finally watching. The hearing had officially concluded, but the atmosphere in room 2141 refused to loosen its grip. The sound of chairs shifting, pens being capped, and murmurs rising was muffled, like background noise from another dimension. All eyes still rested on one man. Chief Justice John Roberts gathered his notes, stacking them with deliberate care, though his fingers trembled slightly at the edges. He didn't look up, not at first. The man who had walked into the room with a spine of steel and the weight of the Constitution behind him now looked like he was carrying something heavier than law, something harder to shake: doubt. He stood slowly, his chair let out a dull scrape against the polished floor, and that sound, so ordinary, cut through the hush like a gunshot. His aides, pale and anxious, moved to his side, ready to shield him from the crush of questions they knew waited outside. The hallway was already filling with press. Microphones would swarm him like flies. But Roberts didn't step forward, not yet. He paused in the doorway, one hand resting on the wooden frame like a man deciding whether to leave a battlefield or return to it. Then he turned. His eyes found Jasmine across the chamber, not with fury, not with the chill of judicial detachment, but with something far rarer in these halls: a flicker of humility. A beat passed, another. And then he spoke, his voice low but deliberate, each syllable sounding less like a defense and more like confession. "You've done something today that I didn't think anyone could," he said. "You made me look at myself." The sentence hung in the air like incense, quiet, fragrant, impossible to ignore. It wasn't applause-worthy, it wasn't scripted, it was real, and it landed heavier than any gavel ever could. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She held his gaze, not to challenge, but to absorb the weight of that moment, to mark it, to make sure the room remembered that even power, when faced with truth, must sometimes blink. And then softly, almost too softly for the cameras to hear, She turned to her aide and said only two words. "Let's begin." There was no triumph in her tone, no self-congratulation, just precision, purpose, resolve. Because this had never been about one exchange or one man. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the spark before the firestorm. She hadn't come to win applause. She came to pull the curtain back. And now that the curtain had fallen, the real work could begin. Across the room, a few aides exchanged stunned looks. A junior clerk from Maine muttered under her breath, "Did that just happen?" But no one answered, because everyone knew it had happened, and nothing would be the same again. Roberts turned back toward the hallway, his figure silhouetted against the light pouring in from outside. But he didn't carry the same authority he'd walked in with. He carried something else, a shadow of reckoning that would follow him long after this day. And Jasmine, she remained seated for another full minute, calm, steady, untouchable. Not because she had broken the court, but because she had reminded the country that it could be held accountable. As the door closed behind the Chief Justice, the hush finally gave way to motion. Reporters sprinted for cameras. Staffers made calls. Senators whispered about fallout. But at the center of it all, unmoved, sat the woman who had just shifted the national conversation with one line, one voice, and the kind of clarity that no institution could silence. And somewhere outside, the country was listening. Power doesn't scream when it breaks. It hums. It vibrates under the surface like a fault line waiting to give. And on that afternoon, after Jasmine Crockett uttered the words, "Let's begin," the foundation beneath America's most sacred institution didn't crumble, but it shifted. Not with thunder, with precision. Not in a single room, but across the country. Inside the Capitol, the usual post-hearing choreography unraveled. Staffers didn't immediately leap into spin control. Reporters didn't rush the exits with hot takes. Something, unnamed but undeniable, had rooted them in place. A few whispered, some stared. One aide, clutching a tablet, simply said, "I think we just witnessed something historic." A moment like that doesn't come from volume or anger. It comes from truth, wielded with the cold stillness of someone who's walked through fire and no longer fears heat. Outside room 2141, the quarters of Congress were unusually still. Men in tailored suits, senators who'd coasted on reputation for decades, glanced toward the room like they were afraid of what might still be echoing from within. Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't grandstanded. She had simply dismantled one of the most insulated men in American law, with facts, questions, and the unrelenting steadiness of someone who no longer accepted the lie that power equals virtue. In a coffee shop 3 blocks away, a Junior Hill staffer replayed the clip on his cracked iPhone, earbuds trembling from the sharp stillness of her tone. Around him, people leaned in, not because of the usual spectacle, but because they saw something unfamiliar in Washington: consequence. The effect rippled outward, quiet but furious. At the Department of Justice's Office of Government Ethics, Michelle Torrey, an ethics compliance officer known for keeping her head down, sat alone in her cubicle at 6:47 p.m., rewatching the entire exchange for the third time. She had worked on a dormant internal inquiry 2 years prior regarding luxury gifts, undisclosed ties, and what she had once called the untouchable class. She had submitted a memo. It went nowhere, died in a locked drawer under the weight of politics. But now, after that hearing, it stirred again. She dug through her archive files and found it. Memo 019, potential violations, judicial disclosures. Scribbled in the margin were her own words from 2 years ago. "We can't prove it, but we know." This time she didn't file it away. She printed it and sent it up the chain. Meanwhile, at Georgetown Law, Professor David Halpern, a man who had clerked under Justice O'Connor and once believed the system would police itself, paused mid-lecture. His students were staring at their screens instead of their notes. "All right," he said, closing his laptop. "We're not doing theory today." He turned to the board and scrawled a single phrase: "Appearance of impropriety." Then under it, Crockett versus Roberts. Let's talk about what that really means. On cable news, anchors fumbled for framing. One tried calling it an unexpected confrontation, while another dared call it reckless. But the audience wasn't buying it. Comment sections filled not with partisanship, but clarity. She said it without raising her voice. I've waited 20 years to hear someone speak like that. We finally saw power have to explain itself. But it wasn't just elites reacting. In a steelworkers union hall in Youngstown, Ohio, a man named Frank, 58, former Marine, long disillusioned, stood before a group of younger workers and played the clip over the sound system. The room went dead silent. When it ended, no one cheered. No one clapped. Frank just said, "That's what accountability's supposed to sound like." He hadn't voted in 12 years. That night, he registered again. Across state capitals, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, legislators began whispering about judicial reform again. Not publicly, not yet, but the ground had moved beneath their feet. Lobbyists who once laughed off talk of Supreme Court accountability now stayed quiet in meetings. A memo from a conservative think tank leaked the next morning. The subject line read, "Urgent, contain the Crockett effect." And in private chambers, behind walls designed to keep the public out, a handful of federal judges, lifetime appointees, watched the clip in silence. Some seethed, others listened, but all of them knew what it meant. The curtain had been pulled back, not with rage, but with surgical poise. Jasmine hadn't insulted the court. She had reminded it of what it was supposed to be before the private jets, the sealed records, and the silent nods from billionaires. Because truth isn't loud, it's undeniable. And something inside the American system had just shifted. Not in a headline, not in a speech, in the collective gut feeling of millions of people who knew something was wrong, but had never heard it spoken from within the walls of power. Until now, the first calls didn't come from journalists or politicians. They came from people, not the kind who sit in Senate chambers or wear badges into courtrooms, but the ones who fill pews on Sundays, who fought wars overseas, who worked steel in Pittsburgh or ran farms outside Topeka. They called not to complain, not to scream, but to say something few in power had heard in years. Thank you. In Jasmine Crockett's district office, the voicemail inbox filled in hours. One caller, his voice cracked with age, left just 4 words. "You spoke for me." Another, from a retired police officer in Baton Rouge, said, "I've testified under oath more times than I can count, but I've never seen someone hold a man like that to his." These weren't policy debates. They weren't about party lines. They were about something older, deeper, the longing for someone to finally tell the truth without flinching. Emails flooded in, thousands, then tens of thousands. A Vietnam vet in Montana wrote, "I stopped trusting government after 72. I never thought I'd feel something like this again. But what you said, that was real. That was earned." A single mother in Kansas sent a letter. "I went to court 3 years ago and was told my son's case wasn't serious enough. Your story about Carla? That was me. Thank you for making them hear it." By morning, her office's lines were jammed. Local staff scrambled to bring in volunteers just to process the messages. Reporters called it a viral moment. But it wasn't viral like a meme. It was cellular. It got into people's bones. Because Jasmine hadn't performed. She had testified, not on behalf of a bill or a party, but on behalf of the forgotten. The second wave of calls was louder and came from the top. A senior advisor to the Speaker of the House rang her office directly. "What's your availability next week?" he asked, voice tight, controlled. "The leadership wants to meet. They want to understand what happened in there." Across the aisle, a moderate Republican from Wisconsin sent a private text. "Don't agree with you on much, but what you did, that was something this place needed." Even the president's chief counsel reportedly circled her name in a morning briefing. The White House didn't release a statement. Not yet, but the silence said enough. They were watching, and they weren't alone. At the Judicial Conference of the United States, where the judiciary reviews its internal procedures, a closed-door meeting was hastily scheduled. Topic: public trust erosion post-Crockett hearing. For years, they had swatted away reform proposals with vague promises of self-regulation. But now the conversation had a name, and it was no longer abstract. One committee member reportedly asked, "What if the public doesn't wait for us to act?" No one in the room had an answer. Think tanks scrambled too. The Brookings Institution issued a midnight memo titled, "The Integrity Question, What Crockett Exposed," while the Heritage Foundation called for an urgent internal review. Normally, these institutions argued across oceans, but now both were staring at the same iceberg. Meanwhile, something quieter happened. In a modest two-story home in Texas, an elderly black woman sat at her kitchen table, watching the clip for the fifth time. Her husband, a retired machinist, leaned over her shoulder. She turned and whispered, "That girl up there, that's what I prayed for in '68. He didn't answer, just nodded. Sometimes vindication doesn't come with cheers. It comes with stillness. The impact wasn't just political, it was generational. In high schools across America, civics teachers scrapped their lesson plans. They played the hearing. Students watched in silence. Some shifted in their chairs. Others asked questions they never had before. One 17-year-old in Houston raised her hand and said, "So, if the law can be questioned, then we're not powerless?" And for the first time in that classroom, the teacher didn't have to give the answer. Jasmine Crockett already had. On social media, the conversation evolved. Nashar Crockett effect began trending alongside Let Them Answer and Golden Cage. But the hashtags weren't enough. Activists mobilized, lawyers convened. A group of former public defenders drafted a petition, demanding the Supreme Court adopt a formal, enforceable code of ethics, like every other court in the country. Within 48 hours, over 3.2 million signatures, a number not even the court could ignore. And in an unexpected twist, some sitting judges began to speak, privately, anonymously, but with clear intent. One federal judge in the Ninth Circuit gave an off-the-record quote to a legal journalist. "I've sat on this bench for 22 years. I've never seen someone walk into a hearing and make a justice look like a man again." Jasmine had touched something raw, untended for too long, because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the great American question. Is justice something that lives in marble halls, or in the people willing to hold those halls accountable? And now? That question was being asked, out loud, everywhere. And the answers were no longer coming from robes and titles. They were coming from us. The cameras were gone. The marble halls were silent. Outside the Capitol, the city had shifted back into its usual rhythm, cars honking, aides rushing across streets, late dinners and crowded bars. But miles away, in a quiet apartment tucked behind a church in the southeast D.C., Jasmine Crockett sat awake, staring at the ceiling, and knew one thing for certain. She had started something she couldn't walk away from. Her heels sat abandoned near the doorway. The blazer that had faced down a Supreme Court justice hung limply over the back of a chair. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional buzz of her phone. Texts, missed calls, news alerts. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. Her face was everywhere. Her voice, her questions, her silence after Robert stumbled, all of it had become national oxygen. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She hadn't even changed clothes. On the coffee table sat a photo of her mother, hands calloused from factory work, eyes soft but unyielding. And beside that, a worn file folder, the same one she had carried into room 2141. Inside it were names, not headlines. Carla Jennings, Jorge Salgado, Nia Reynolds, David Huang, real people, real cases, real pain. None of them would trend on Twitter, but all of them were the reason she couldn't sleep. Because while the country buzzed with applause, Jasmine Crockett sat there with the ache of truth. Not the kind that wins arguments, but the kind that costs something. And she felt every inch of it pressing on her chest like the weight of a courtroom door closing. Her phone lit up again. A senator had texted, "You're changing the game. Let me know if you're thinking higher office." She didn't respond, because that wasn't what this was about. It never had been. In her mind, she replayed Robert's face. Not the part where he fumbled, but the part just after. The moment when the mask slipped. When he saw her not as a freshman congresswoman, not as a headline, but as a reckoning. That flicker of recognition haunted her, not because it pleased her, but because it proved something she'd always feared. Even the most powerful men don't reflect until they're forced to. And still, she couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot to the window. The city lights shimmered like fireflies. Somewhere out there, in homes filled with silence and survival, people were watching clips of her testimony, not because she was famous, but because they finally saw themselves in power for once. A black woman, a former public defender, someone who wasn't supposed to speak like that, wear that ring, raise those questions, and yet there she was, steady, surgical, unafraid. She took a breath, deep, held it, released. She thought of the men who had ruled for decades without question, of every time she'd been told to wait her turn, to tone it down, to earn her place, and she thought about what she had said to her aide earlier that day when Roberts turned back and whispered, "You made me look at myself." 2 words. Let's begin. Because Jasmine knew the fight wasn't over. It had barely started. The court hadn't changed overnight. Roberts hadn't resigned. No ethics code had passed yet. But something had cracked. And once marble cracks, it never fully seals again. That's how water gets in. That's how change begins. The clock read 3:14 a.m. She rubbed her eyes, sat on the floor, opened the file again, not to relive the hearing, but to read the last letter inside. It was from a prisoner in Huntsville, Texas. Handwritten, shaky script. It ended with one sentence. If someone like you can ask them why, maybe one day they'll have to answer to the rest of us too. She closed the folder. Still not tired, but no longer restless. She wasn't waiting for justice to wake up. She was going to drag it out of bed herself. She didn't rest, not because she couldn't, but because too many others never got the chance. And as the world began to react to what she'd done, the story beneath the headlines finally revealed itself. Not about one woman's voice, but about a nation's silence finally being broken. It would have been easy to walk away, to let the moment pass and return to business as usual. That's what power counts on, that we forget, that we move on, that the echo fades, that truth, no matter how loud, eventually drowns in comfort and distraction. But this time, it didn't. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she held the room, and by doing so, she held up a mirror to all of us. What we saw wasn't flattering. We saw a justice system more concerned with preserving prestige than pursuing truth. We saw a Chief Justice struggling to justify double standards with rehearsed language that suddenly rang hollow. And more painfully, we saw a woman, composed, razor-sharp, carrying names and stories and facts like weapons, being dismissed until she forced them to listen. And when she did, the nation remembered something it had almost forgotten. Power without accountability is not leadership, it's abandonment. This wasn't the story of a political ambush. It wasn't theatrics. It wasn't rage. It was surgical courage. Crockett didn't attack the institution. She demanded it live up to the very ideals it claimed to protect. That was the message. We will no longer bow to the robe if the robe refuses to bow to truth. In that moment, Jasmine was not simply a congresswoman. She became the embodiment of every American who has ever sat in the back of a courtroom, clutching evidence that no one wanted to see. Every mother who begged for fairness while watching her child get sentenced for a crime others walk away from. Every veteran who defended the Constitution only to return home and be denied the justice he fought to protect. Every blue-collar father who knew the system worked, but never for him. For them, she wasn't just speaking truth to power, she was speaking on their behalf, and the power finally had to listen. The hearing may have ended in silence, but across America, a different kind of noise began to rise. Not protest, not chaos, awakening. In city halls, ordinary people began asking their council members hard questions. If the Supreme Court isn't held to a code of ethics, why should we believe in yours? In courtrooms from Tulsa to Detroit, young public defenders played Jasmine's clip during training seminars. One instructor stood at the front of a law school classroom in Chicago and said, "Forget moot court. This is what real advocacy looks like." Even behind locked doors in state bar associations, the conversation changed. One judge, anonymous in transcript, admitted, "I saw her stare him down, and I asked myself, when was the last time I let someone question me like that?" because that was the true weight of what happened that day. She didn't beat Roberts. She reminded him he could bleed, not physically, but institutionally, legally, morally. She cracked the myth of invincibility around his chair, not with a hammer, but with a whisper. You don't get to hold justice and hide from judgment. And the silence that followed, that wasn't defeat. That was exposure. But this isn't just about courts or judges. The message she left behind reached further than marble pillars and law reviews. It reached into living rooms, truck stops, school cafeterias, and factory floors. Into the places where men who have served, sacrificed, and struggled sat with their arms crossed, waiting to roll their eyes. But they didn't, because Jasmine didn't speak at them. She spoke for them. For the man in Arkansas whose Social Security case got buried in red tape. For the coal worker in West Virginia whose lung disease claim was dismissed after 20 years of service. For the nurse in rural Alabama who was told she didn't qualify for legal assistance. For the janitor in Phoenix whose wrongful eviction was filed under the wrong case code and never corrected. She wasn't reciting statistics. She was naming the weight these people carry every day. And when she looked a Supreme Court justice in the eye and asked if he even remembered what the people saw when they looked at his court, they all knew the answer. Power that forgets who it serves is no longer justice. It's shadow. But Jasmine Crockett's legacy isn't just what she said. It's what she started. After her testimony, an unprecedented bipartisan resolution was introduced, demanding that the U.S. Supreme Court be held to the same enforceable ethics standards as lower courts. Legal scholars called it performative. Lobbyists called it impossible. But the people? They called it finally. By the following week, town halls were packed. Activists didn't chant. They handed out copies of judicial financial disclosures and taught senior citizens how to file FOIA requests. This wasn't outrage. This was infrastructure, a different kind of power, a patient kind, a relentless kind, the kind Jasmine had carried in her folder all along. And then something remarkable happened. Carla Jennings, the single mother from Texas whose story Jasmine had told, received a letter in the mail. It was from a federal appeals clerk. It said her case was being reviewed again. No guarantees, no promises, just a second look. That's all she ever wanted, a chance. So what's the lesson? It's not that courage wins. Sometimes it doesn't. It's not that truth changes everything overnight. Sometimes it doesn't. The lesson is this. The people closest to the pain must be closest to the power. Because no system, not a court, not a government, not a nation, can survive when it forgets the people it was built to protect. And sometimes it takes just one voice, spoken clearly, fearlessly, and with relentless clarity, to remind an empire of its promises. Jasmine Crockett didn't burn the court down. She simply turned on the light and made sure the rest of us could see exactly what had been hiding in the dark. But stories like Jasmine's aren't meant to be admired from a distance. They're meant to ignite something. Because if one woman can face down the highest court in the land and make it blink, then none of us have an excuse to stay silent anymore. Now is not the time to sit back. Not when injustice wears a robe. Not when silence is marketed as dignity. Not when systems built to serve are weaponized to survive. Jasmine Crockett didn't risk her reputation just to create a moment. She built a mirror and dared every one of us to look in. The question now is, what are we going to do with what we saw? Don't wait for the next hearing. Don't wait for the next hashtag. Don't wait for the next Carla or Jorge to be denied a fair shot. Demand real oversight. Share this story. Write your representatives. Sign the petitions. Join the legal coalitions calling for a formal Supreme Court code of ethics. Show up in your city council, your school board, your local courtrooms, and remind them, we're watching now. Because justice isn't self-sustaining. It needs fuel. It needs questions. It needs inconvenient truth. And it needs people, ordinary people, willing to speak up when the room goes quiet. That's how Jasmine did it. That's how we must do it too. Power only shifts when pressure meets purpose. So if this story lit something in you, don't let it burn out. Let it burn forward. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.